only 12% of American adults is metabolically healthy. You can talk about viruses all you want, but that's not what's killing most people on our planet.
So most of the time when we're eating fructose, it's in the form of fruit, right? Which you said is okay. It's in the form of high fructose corn syrup, which is different in structure than regular sugar. Both contain glucose and fructose, but they're different. Can you explain how they're different? And is table sugar as bad as high fructose corn syrup?
And I would say that,
how do we think about that?
Most of the time, when you say most of the time, we get our fructose from eating fruit. Actually,
not now, but we should be getting it. We should
very little of our fructose. When we recognize that, more than 60% of the foods in the grocery store that carry a barcode are sweetened. And by and large, that sweetener is either directly high fructose corn syrup or a derivative thereof. It means that there's an awful lot of fructose going into our diets to make us satisfy our desire for sweet and buy the product. I mean, I'm speaking to the choir here. This is what you've been talking about for years. Hacking into a primitive survival mechanism that says, seek out sweet foods and you will survive. Well, now, all the foods are sweet and they're making us sick. So high fructose corn syrup is 55% fructose as opposed to table sugar or sucrose, which is a 50-50 mix between glucose, which is less sweet, and fructose, which is much sweeter. The reason that we use high fructose corn syrup, that's older technology. It was actually University of Oklahoma in 1957 was when we first saw the development of the process to make high fructose corn syrup, is basically because it's very sweet and it's really cheap. Hey, sign me up if I'm a food producer. I want something that's sweet. I can use less of it, and it's cheap, so our bottom line goes way up.
That's right. That's why I asked the vice chair of Pepsi once, and why use high fructose corn syrup in your studies? Because the government makes it too cheap for us not to use it.
Well, the government to this day sponsors corn production to the tune of $500 billion a year. I mean, and where does a lot of that corn go? It goes to high fructose corn syrup to make us eat more sweets. And, the argument has been that fructose is not glucose. Therefore, it's a safer sugar because it's not going to, when you metabolize
raise your blood
fructose,
sugar. It doesn't raise your blood sugar, actually.
That's the party line. It doesn't raise your blood sugar and doesn't require insulin for its metabolism. Therefore, it's safe. Well, immediately when you consume fructose, you turn on gluconeogenesis. You turn on the process to power your brain as a survival mechanism with higher levels of glucose. You also compromise insulin functionality right off the bat. So you are setting the stage for becoming a diabetic. It's been one study indicated, a really large study, 42,000 men, 49,000 women, determined that about a quarter of all the diabetes in the Western world is directly related to elevation of uric acid. Where do we get uric acid? Only from three sources: from alcohol, same metabolism as fructose, and from a class of chemicals that are called purines. Purines are the breakdown products of DNA and RNA from foods that are rich in purines, things like organ meat and game. Yeah. Organ meats, game would be liver and kidney. And how do you eat those? I don't know. But
are you kidding? I love chicken livers. My mom used to make chicken livers all the time for me. Chicken livers and onions or rice. Really yummy.
I get that. I could never tolerate it. I ran away from home.
Chopped liver. Come on.
what do I look like? But that said, by and large, that's not the issue. I mean, it's not necessarily the purines. Traditionally,
because that was the old thinking, right? Is that don't eat meat, don't drink wine. That's what's causing gout. But nobody really talks about the sugar aspect or the fructose aspect. But that's really the major driver.
That is the issue. It's the fructose. It's not really, 2/3 of the purines in your metabolism come from your own breakdown of your own muscle that you do whenever you exercise. And alcohol is certainly contributing to the uric acid pool. But the big elephant in the room is the uric acid derived directly from fructose metabolism,
which is a molecule that doctors often measure in the blood. We think it's associated with gout, but we don't pay much attention to it other than that. And yet it turns out it's a really important marker for many long-standing metabolic issues that our population is suffering from. In fact, it's the biggest threat to our planet. in 20, I think 20, 88% of Americans are metabolically unhealthy. That means they have some form of prediabetes, high blood sugar, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, and it's driving this host of chronic illnesses that are including obesity, diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's. So what's the deal with uric acid? Like I often measure it. I see it high with people with insulin resistance and diabetes. And I thought it was a marker of some inflammation and some other issues, but I really didn't really treat it directly. I was always treating the underlying issue, which was the blood sugar and so forth. Unless someone had gout, then I'd give them a drug or cherry extract or something. But tell us, why did you kind of hit on uric acid, and what are the reasons it's so important?
Boy, there's a lot of places to go, aren't there? How
Yeah.
did I come upon this? I would say that, as like you, over the years, I've been really fixated on metabolic disorders. I'm a neurologist. And why would I be interested in diabetes and hypertension and obesity and dyslipidemia? Because they pave the way for certain neurologic problems that I then,
Yeah.
then land in my lap, for which at that point there is very little recourse. What are we going to do? I mean, we all saw what happened in 2021 with respect to a new so-called Alzheimer's drug. We don't have anything. So if we can get to the root cause of some of these issues in neurology, you mentioned other things like diabetes and cancer and cardiovascular disease, we can understand the fire and not just focus on the smoke or the end product, then we have a leg up. We can keep people healthy as opposed to simply focusing on treating them. And so that sets the stage for me being open to understanding new developments in terms of what are the causes of these metabolic
Yeah.
problems. And the truth of the matter is, this came to me one day while I was running. And typically when I run, I listen to either music or podcasts. I was listening to a podcast of an interview of a nephrologist from the University of Colorado by the name of Richard Johnson,
No.
who for the past 2 decades has focused on the role of fructose in metabolic issues
Hmm.
and the primal mechanism of uric acid then in leading to these the host of metabolic issues, that the role of uric acid plays in elevating our blood pressure, in leading to gluconeogenesis, the new production of blood sugar, in making us insulin resistant, in
Mm.
increasing our production of body fat, in locking up our body fat so that we
Wow.
can't tap into it as an energy source. And we'll talk about that, how we as humans have this predisposition by virtue of our elevated uric acid. So we've all known for a long time that fructose is a bad player, right?
Mm.
We see correlations between fructose consumption and the very things that we're talking about. But we've never really understood, well, how in the heck does that happen? What's the link? And
Mm.
what Dr. Johnson was doing 20 years ago is he was creating hypertension, elevated blood pressure in laboratory animals by feeding them fructose. They would develop high blood pressure. And
Wow.
he noted that, as a matter of fact, that their uric, in doing a blood panel, looking at all kinds of things, that their uric acid levels would go up when he gave them fructose. Well, you would expect that because
Hmm.
unlike glucose, fructose is metabolized directly into uric acid. That's where it comes from fructose. There are
Mm.
2 other
Mm.
sources we'll talk about. So he noted that. He said, well, isn't that interesting? Uric acid levels increased. Then he did something really fascinating. He gave them a lot of fructose, but he
Yeah.
blocked the uric acid production by giving them a gout pill called allopurinol.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, here they're eating all this fructose and they're not getting high blood pressure because uric acid was not elevating.
Fascinating.
That is huge.
Fascinating.
And he determined then, by repeating the study in men, the same thing happened. Give them a lot of fructose. Within a couple of weeks, blood pressure goes up, weight goes up, insulin resistance increases, blood sugar goes up. But if you give them allopurinol, and where you and I are going with this today is not to say everyone should take this drug. We'll talk about what you can do. But lo and behold, the same thing happened in humans. So that was groundbreaking. And at that point, he began his research. But it's interesting to note that in 1894, Dr. Alexander Haig, a different Alexander Haig,
No.
wrote a book entitled Uric Acid, A Factor in the Causation of Disease, and
Mm.
looked at things like dementia and hypertension and
Mm.
depression and certainly rheumatism or joint problems, and really discussed it way back then, but it remained buried, until just
Yeah.
about 20 years ago. Now, researchers around the world are looking at this and describing what to do. So, yes, it's a marker. You were correct in saying, you notice that it's elevated, but there was an interesting report that came out of Turkey and Japan in 2016 that looked at uric acid elevation in metabolic syndrome as no longer being in the title, innocent bystander, but
Mm.
playing a central role. That
Yeah.
it's actually mechanistically involved in causing these problems. It doesn't just happen to be elevated because people have a crappy diet or they're not
Right.
exercising, not sleeping well. It is the cause, an
Wow.
important cause.
Wow. So David, people are listening probably going, well, geez, does that mean I can't have an apple, or is it just high fructose corn syrup that you get in soda and processed food? Like what's the deal?
It's a great question. I can't. I can tell you it's something I'm asked every day. And here's what the literature tells us, and it's really quite interesting in that if you eat apple, if you eat 5 grams of fructose, or 2 apples, 10, 15 grams of fructose, all well and good. An apple has quercetin, it has other bioflavonoids, it has vitamin
Fiber.
C, fiber, which
Yeah.
slows fructose absorption, it has vitamin C, which aids in uric acid excretion, as opposed to drinking a 12-ounce glass, 42 grams of fructose, of orange juice or apple juice, or certainly a soda. Those are the potent sources of fructose that we need to stay away from. Immediately tells your body something very important. That
Now,
fructose signals your body that winter's coming. It's telling your body that caloric scarcity is coming. You might
yeah.
starve. You better make fat. You better turn on your production of glucose to power your brain. You better elevate your blood pressure because you're not going to have water to drink. It's setting
Mm-hmm.
the stage for survival.
Mm.
And this is a fascinating story that dates back about 15 million years ago, when the Earth cooled. And there was some very powerful selective pressure on our primate ancestors for survival during times of food scarcity. And it turns out that around that time, there was a mutation, was actually a series of mutations in the genes that made an enzyme called uricase. Uricase breaks down uric acid and would lead
Mm.
to a lower
Mm.
uric acid level.
Yeah.
But this mutation disrupted how uricase worked. So those who inherited this mutation had higher levels of uric acid. They made more fat. They survived. So
Mm.
we, as humans and other great apes, still have that mutation in uricase. So we have 4 to 5 times higher levels of uric acid than other non-primate mammals. These days, what we're experiencing is called an evolutionary environmental mismatch. So we're stuck with these outdated physiology that allowed our Paleolithic ancestors to survive, our hunter-gatherer forebears to survive when there wasn't any food. If they
Mm.
could stumble on some berries, a little bit of fructose, make a little bit more fat, didn't take a lot. Not that it made them fat, but just enough fat to hold them over till they could find food, whether it was on the ground dead or they dug it up or whatever.
Well, David, I
So
know you spent a lot of time on your boat up in Alaska, but the grizzly bears up there, they eat salmon in the early part of the summer, and they don't really gain much weight. Then they go up in the mountains and they eat all the berries, and they gain like 500 pounds from eating berries. Right?
that's right.
And
Well,
what you're saying is really important, because we have a lot of mechanisms that are adapted to starvation. People don't realize this, that we have hundreds of genes and mechanisms in our body that are really good at dealing with scarcity, but almost none that are dealing with abundance, because we've never had to deal with this before. We never lived in a food carnival before. We never lived in a food lollapalooza, where there's everything all the time in abundance and the worst possible crap you can imagine. So our bodies don't know how to cope with it. And so this mechanism, which actually is designed to help us stay alive, is actually killing us now.
that's right. And again, we call it an evolutionary environmental mismatch. I wrote my first article on this in the Miami Herald in 1971 when I was 16.
Oh,
And
wow. You're ahead
and
of
it
the
was
game, huh, David?
I was, it's crazy. And I said, what about us, the people of today who are sort of saddled with this outdated machinery. That was how I ended the article, because evolution isn't going to save us. We're not going to be able to evolve quickly enough the mechanisms to deal with exactly what, Mark, you've been writing about for years. And this is this horrendous assault upon our physiology by the very foods that are now global. We used to talk about the American diet, the standard American diet, the Western diet. It's global now. Face it. And, we talked about in Brainwash how that threatens connections in the brain that make us less empathetic. But, that's for another conversation you and I have already had with Austin.
Well, that's a good podcast. You should all listen to that podcast, because just to summarize it quickly, if I get this wrong, tell me. But essentially, our modern diet, which is super inflammatory, disconnects our frontal lobe, which is the adult in the room, from the limbic brain, which is the reptile, lizard, fight or flight, reproduction, feeding behavior, which is very triggerable. And so all of a sudden, the grown-up in the room is not managing the intense emotions of this limbic part of our brain. And so we act in ways that are destructive or violent or aggressive. And we see that in our society now as being a massively divided society, whether it's you're paleo or you're vegan or Republican or Democrat or Jewish or Palestinian or Muslim or Christian. It just goes on and on. And your argument is that part of that divisiveness could be related to what we're eating.
That's right. And, what a match made in heaven that you and I are talking today, because this has been your messaging for so long. And, for me, it's more about, what are the implications of that as it relates to behavior and the brain? And now we know that, this uric acid, because of its elevation, threatens some really important physiology. As an example, it compromises the action of a chemical called nitric oxide. We need nitric oxide to do two very important things. It allows our blood vessels to relax, so we have good blood flow to our kidneys, our heart, and certainly to our brains. In addition, nitric oxide and that effect of nitric oxide in blood vessels is what helps insulin do its job. Insulin requires nitric oxide to get out of the artery and also into the muscle cell to let it change glucose into glycogen and help keep our blood sugars under control. That is threatened by uric acid. And, one other really interesting mechanism I think that you hinted about on when you were talking about the bears eating all the berries to get ready to hibernate is that that's a uric acid mediated event in them. They shift over between two very important pathways of metabolism. One is called AMP kinase, and the other is called AMP deaminase. When we are stimulating AMP deaminase, we are favoring fat production. We are favoring locking up our fat. We are favoring the metabolic issues that we want to avoid. AMP kinase, on the other hand, which is not something that uric acid favors, is when we burn our fat, it keeps our blood sugars in check, your insulin sensitivity goes up. And, basically that's what we do. We want to stimulate AMP kinase. It's why we exercise. It's why diabetics take metformin, is to stimulate this AMP kinase. That's exactly what's not happening when bears are getting ready to hibernate. Once they're hibernating and they're burning their fat, then AMP kinase is activated. And it looks like uric acid is involved in that switch one way or the other. Where does the AMP come from? Very interesting. The AMP comes from the metabolism of fructose. When fructose is metabolized, it's an energy consuming event, unlike glucose. ATP is converted into AMP. Then where does the AMP go? We just talked about that. So it's totally a different kettle of fish. How fructose is metabolized. Fructose is the sugar of energy storage, and glucose is the currency of energy utilization. And as different as night and day. The real concern is that the metabolism of fructose into uric acid feeds back to cause more metabolism of fructose. It's a feed-forward cycle. So uric acid stimulates the production of an enzyme called fructokinase, which is the first enzyme to break down fructose. So it's self-perpetuating. And what does that fructose do? It inhibits leptin sensitivity, so we eat more. Leptin
is the hunger suppressing hormone.
Right. And that's inhibited by our consumption of fructose. So we eat, and this was a great mechanism when to get ready for winter, so we would eat more. That's why the bears are doing what they're doing. They're preparing to hibernate. And if
We just
any of
we
your
just eat
viewers,
all winter, is our problem.
if any of your viewers are getting ready to hibernate, then have at it. Then that's for you. Eat a lot of fructose. But I think it's, to get back to your original question that, you and I talked about or learned about uric acid in the context of gout.
Yeah.
If you had high uric acid, you might get gout, you might get kidney stones. But now we have a term it's pathetic. It's called asymptomatic hyperuricemia, which means you have elevated uric acid, but hey, you don't have gout. Therefore, it's not important. And
No.
Asymptomatic hyperuricemia is clearly associated with hypertension, with
Yeah.
obesity, with chronic
Diabetes.
kidney disease, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. One interesting study out of Japan looked at individuals with so-called asymptomatic hyperuricemia and found that they had significant increased risk for becoming overweight, for developing problems with their lipids, and even hypertension, important components of the metabolic syndrome. And, you started off with our discussion saying that 88% of American adults have at least one component of the metabolic syndrome. It means only 12% of American adults
Healthy.
is metabolically healthy. And these are the big issues of our day. You can talk about viruses all you want. Sure, that's important, but that's not what's killing most people on our planet. What's killing most
for
people
sure.
right now are the chronic degenerative conditions: coronary artery disease, Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes. These are metabolic
It's almost
issues.
50 million deaths a year.
Yeah, and related to the
50
foods we eat.
million deaths a year, mostly
With an
attributed
M,
to the
that's
food we
right.
eat. Yeah.
And
David, I just want to sort of loop back a little bit because I want people to understand what this fructose thing is. So basically, we're getting it from high fructose corn syrup, which you said is 55% fructose, but it's actually, in some studies I've seen, up to 75%
that's right.
fructose. And
That's
also,
right.
it's important for people to understand that in traditional sugar, fructose and glucose are bound together with a chemical bond. So they take some metabolism and they're not as quickly absorbed. Fructose in high fructose corn syrup is free fructose. And the other thing that you didn't quite mention, I'd love to hear your opinion about this, is work from Bruce Ames, where fructose requires energy to be absorbed, as opposed to sugar, which has a transport channel that doesn't require the use of energy. And when you use that energy for fructose and you're having mostly fructose as your sugar, it's causing depletion of ATP in your gut, which then causes the tight junctions, which are the things that prevent you from having a leaky gut to keep your cells stuck together like Legos. It causes those to separate, and then you get leaky gut, which then even exacerbates the problem of obesity and insulin resistance and diabetes through another mechanism, which is endotoxemia from the metabolic byproducts of bacteria and weird things in the gut. So it may be that fructose is causing problems with many, many reasons, partly obviously this metabolic effects, but also the gut effects, which exacerbate the metabolic effects.
That's right. And again, this is all amplified by then the metabolism, which is an energy dependent event, ATP to AMP, then to uric acid. And that uric acid then enhances in the gut more pro-inflammatory bacteria, also dramatically increases the gut permeability, therefore increases inflammation. And how interesting it is that one disease that is associated with elevated uric acid, which is gout, has actually been demonstrated to be significantly improved in people undergoing what's called a fecal microbial transplant, where healthy fecal material is taken from an individual and then put into the colon of a person with gout. Remarkable reduction in the number of gout attacks without any significant dietary change.
That's
So
amazing.
it's true. So, we're back to talking about the gut, a place where you and I default to over the years, and rightfully so. But so uric acid itself is having such a dramatic effect on the gut
Just on the
that
microbiome itself, right?
you bet enhances inflammation. So if we recognize that inflammation is certainly a centerpiece of the damage done by uric acid, then all of the downstream issues related to inflammation might well be anticipated to be increased in people with high uric acid levels. And in fact, that's what we see. In a 2018 study looking at 42,000, I think I mentioned earlier, 42,000 men and 49,000 women, and followed these individuals over an 8-year period of time. What did they find? They found that all-cause mortality was dramatically increased in those individuals with high levels of uric acid.
Yeah.
That those who had high uric acid had a significant increased risk of cardiovascular-related
Yeah.
mortality of close to 40%, and about a
Yeah.
35% increased risk of stroke-related mortality. This is a big study. I mean, we're talking about
It's a lot.
100,000 people followed over 8 years, having a 35 to 40% increased risk of death from either a heart attack or stroke. And here's something else that the study found I think was really interesting. And that is, for every point elevation of uric acid above 7
Above 7.
milligrams per deciliter, for every point, there is an 8 to 13% increased risk of all-cause mortality. So
Wow.
this is mortality when we look at the cardiovascular, we look at the stroke. This is mortality related to issues that have inflammation as their cornerstone. So it's very important that we consider this, that we consider that uric acid is not just happens to be elevated, that it's playing a mechanistic causal role, and that we should do what we can to check our uric acid levels. You can use a home monitor. I'm going to send you one. Or, people get their annual blood work. Uric acid is almost always on the annual blood work.
Mm-hmm.
What is it? And for your viewers, the place where it needs to be is at or below 5.5. The units are milligrams per deciliter here in America. Typically, the lab will call it out if it's at 7 or higher, because that's the level that it starts to become an issue as it relates to gout and kidney stones.
Yeah.
But as it relates to the metabolic issues that we're talking about, the increased blood sugar, the hypertension, the risk for all the things that we're talking about, we want it at 5.5 or lower. And again, you can go online, go to Amazon, buy a uric acid monitor and check your level. I recently checked mine again, and it's 4.6. So I'm feeling good about that.
That's good. So basically, this uric acid phenomena is really not well understood by most physicians. It's really driven by diet, predominantly our processed diet and high fructose corn syrup, and it drives all these secondary effects of cardiovascular disease, death, Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, and it's something that you can actually easily measure. Your doctor can check it for you when you go to the office. It should be less than 5.5, as you said. What should we do in terms of our diet to reduce uric acid, and what are the worst things that cause uric acid, and what actually helps reduce uric acid?
Sure. Let's talk about the causes or the sources of uric acid. Where's it coming from? And did we mention fructose?
Yes, you did.
Fructose is the gorilla in the room, right? So fructose, again, was our signal that scarcity was coming, that winter is coming, eat the berries. Fructose is telling your body, make fat, raise blood sugar, raise blood pressure because you might not have water to drink. So fructose is, by and large, the biggest player. Fruit juice, sodas, added to sauces, added to just about anything that's in a package these days.
Salad dressing.
You bet. And we love it because it's
tomato
sweet.
sauce, ketchup.
And again, fruit is okay. An apple a day keeps the doctor away, not apples and cherries and high fructose fruits all day long, but have some fruit by all means.
Right.
The next thing to consider that's certainly less important are something called purines. Purines, all fruits, vegetables, and meats, really anything we eat has in it some DNA and RNA. When our bodies break that down, then purines are formed, and purines are directly metabolized into uric acid. And interestingly, uric acid favors that and enhances the production of purines in our bodies. Again, a feed-forward cycle. It's trying to keep us alive during times of food scarcity. So again, we want to avoid those foods that are really rich in purines. I mentioned them already, the organ meats, the shellfish, the smaller fish that we were favoring over time, the anchovies and the sardines. Sure, you can have the anchovies in your Caesar salad, but you don't want to make big meals having 6 ounces or more of any of those.
Oh, I love anchovies.
Yeah, me too. White anchovies, one of my favorites. And the last thing to consider, I think needs a little bit of, we need to double click on this a bit, and that is alcohol. Because alcohol shares the exact same metabolic pathway as fructose. As Robert Lustig has called it, fructose is alcohol without the buzz. So it similarly consumes ATP down to AMP. But in this case, it really matters what kind of alcohol a person is drinking. Wine consumption in men has about zero effect on uric acid. Wine consumption in women actually is associated with lower uric acid. Hard liquor will raise uric acid, but the worst offender is beer. Why? Because beer
Mm.
not only contains alcohol, but it contains purines that we just talked about from
Ah,
the yeast, the brewer's yeast that is used to make beer. So now we understand the biochemistry that underlies the beer belly. It's coming from this elevation of uric acid, packing the fat away, getting ready for winter. So if you're going to choose a beverage, coffee, a good choice, actually associated with lower uric acid. So those are the big things that we should avoid. I will make one other comment as it relates to high purine foods. Many people will pull up a list of high purine foods and see many vegetables, things like broccoli, the cruciferous vegetables in general, like kale. Many vegetables have higher levels of purines. Their consumption, though, is associated with lower uric acid. Why? Because again,
mm.
fiber, bioflavonoids, vitamin C, which increases uric acid excretion. So eat all the vegetables like that you want. You'll never
Hmm.
hear. I don't never say never, but it's going to be hard for me to imagine there'll be a time when I tell people not to eat broccoli or broccoli
Exactly.
sprouts.
Right.
That's going
So,
to be a tough one
so,
for me.
so what are the foods that help bring it down? Because if it's elevated, you can
Right.
stop
So
eating the purine foods and the sugar foods and the high fructose corn syrup foods. What are the
so
things
we
that
know
actually
that
bring it down?
foods that are rich in certain bioflavonoids, for example, quercetin, is a very powerful bioflavonoid. Yes, it's an antioxidant. Yes, it has anti-inflammatory activity. But here's the exciting news about quercetin. A recent study out of Britain demonstrates that 500 milligrams of quercetin a day in just 2 weeks is associated with an 8% lowering of uric acid. That's really significant. So
Wow.
taking quercetin as a supplement is an idea, along with vitamin C. Luteolin also dramatically lowers uric acid on par with allopurinol,
Wow.
which is a
Wow.
pharmaceutical. It's 1-to-1, just about equal to the drug used for gout patients to lower their uric acid. So luteolin and quercetin, very powerful. Vitamin C aids in excretion. I like to round out the program with DHA. It doesn't have direct effects on the pathways that we're talking about, but it does tend to offset some of the damaging effects of fructose in the human body. So those, in terms of supplements, would be good choices. Now, the diet then that you hear me outlining would be one that is mostly plant based. This is the grain brain doctor, who many people said was just the next Atkins telling us all to eat bacon bits. That's not what we're saying. It's not
Yeah.
what I've ever said, but more of a plant-based, higher fiber,
Hmm.
colorful. That's where the bioflavonoids are. Colorful type of plate. That's what we're looking for. It's more sustainable. It's better for you. It's better for your gut bacteria, and it will help bring down your uric acid levels.
So one of the things I often use was cherries, cherry
That's
extract,
right.
which seems a little contradictory because it's a fruit, it's got fructose in it. But I've often treated my patients with high uric acid or gout with cherry extract and found it very effective.
It is very effective. It's more effective in women than in men. But tart cherry is on the list. A cup of cherries, that's what was used in several of the studies. As a matter of fact, if you look at the cover of the book, and I just happen to have one right here, look at the O of the drop acid. That's the cherry. So you're exactly right. Dropping uric acid, using cherries, been used for gout therapy for many, many years, and vitamin C too. Vitamin C, of course, it's a little newer to the game, but for a long time, gout patients were told to take vitamin C and or consume vitamin C rich foods, but not fruit juice. There's
Yeah.
really nothing ancestral about consuming fruit juice. It's not like our hunter gatherer forebears would have been stumbled upon trees with cans and bottles of fruit juice hanging from them and then consume them. That's a powerful
Yeah.
fructose load
Yeah.
that's really unlike anything that our physiology is ready for.
It's staggering how many people have really been brainwashed to think that fruit juice is a healthy drink.
Yeah,
And I'm
it's
like,
a lot of media. And
eat the fruit, skip the juice.
I live in Florida, and orange juice
Orange
is
juice,
second
yeah.
to nature. And
Anita
the idea
Bryant.
you're not having orange juice. What's wrong with you? You didn't have your breakfast until 12 o'clock noon. Again, what's wrong with you? I guess there are a lot of things wrong with me because I take plenty of criticism. But that said, it's the Orange Juice Growers Association or whomever is the lobby that wants us to do certain things, that, the whole grain goodness of these processed cereals that we think is heart healthy. All of this messaging that we've been getting for years and years is hugely effective. And it's what people think is the right thing. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Maybe it is. But it doesn't mean a powerful carbohydrate load at 8 o'clock in the morning is going to set you on your way. So, that's our mission, you and me and so many people, is to kind of, let people hear the other side of the story so they can be better architects of their health destiny.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a problem is, all the things that we're pointing to that we both talked about forever are all really driving this final common pathway of insulin resistance and inflammation that's sort of underlying all these chronic illnesses, from heart disease to diabetes to cancer to Alzheimer's, depression, lots more. And what you're saying is a lot of this may be mediated by this mechanism of uric acid, which is directly related to this sort of load of fructose that's in our diet since probably the 1970s, when high fructose corn syrup started to be used in almost all industrial food products. And it's now really the majority of the sugar that we're consuming. And it's quite different than regular sugar. I mean, but even regular sugar can be a problem, right? Even if you just have regular sugar, it can cause this, right? Because regular sugar has high
It
both
is immediately, yeah,
glucose and
we talked
fructose.
about,
Yeah.
it's fructose, in this case, bound to glucose, but that separation takes place immediately in the small intestine that we then liberate fructose. And interestingly, here's another bit of trivia, but I think it's relevant because
Yeah.
of the amount of sodium added to our foods, the amount of sodium that people are consuming, that this salt in our bloodstream activates enzymes that actually create fructose from glucose. The enzyme is something called
Wow. Wow.
aldolase reductase. But so we're
Mm.
actually making fructose in our bodies from glucose to, again,
It's like a
prepare us
double
for
whammy.
yeah. But again, and it's the sugar in our diets. And, as every 5 years, our government puts out these guidelines. And we wrote, Dr. Casey Means is an individual involved in, getting
Yeah.
out information about blood sugar. I'm sure you know her.
Yeah. She's
And
been on our
we wrote,
podcast for sure.
we wrote an op-ed in MedPage Today that was published February 21st of 21. It was a letter to President Biden saying, look, basically, all the scientists who were involved in creating, giving the information for the USDA to make this policy, indicated that we need to consume less sugar. And yet they didn't lower the number of calories derived from sugar is still 10%, what the government recommends. That was not during the Biden administration, but we were hoping that there could be some intervention to get it down to about 6% of total calories derived from sugar, because it's the big villain. I mean,
It
so
really is.
many
Yeah.
people that you've interviewed have talked about it. It is the big villain.
So, David, what about flour? Because, in my world, there's not that much difference between flour and sugar. Is that also an issue?
Of course it is. And so again, anything, we create these feedback loops um, whereby we enhance these processes that are designed to be enhanced to keep us alive. And as it relates to flour, that will directly elevate our blood sugar. What does that do? That increases insulin resistance. And what happens to insulin when it's not working very well? It goes up. Now, here's where the feed forward plays in. It's really quite fascinating.
Mm.
Higher levels of insulin, that can be a consequence of eating refined carbs like flour. Higher levels of insulin increase uric acid by inhibiting the excretion of uric acid in the kidneys. So now we've tapped into the whole process of uric acid elevation, everything you and I have been talking about, by virtue of the fact that we're eating these refined carbohydrates. So again,
Yeah.
that just activates this mechanism saying, oh my gosh, you're not going to have food very soon. You had better start making fat. You better start
Hmm.
retaining salt because you may not have water. You better start increasing your sugar production through the liver, a process called
Yeah.
gluconeogenesis, to power your brain so you can find food. That's our ace in the hole. We're not the strongest, we're not the fastest, but we have this brain that can help us find food. And, our biggest issues throughout our history were starvation and predation. In other words, either we found food or we were food for somebody else that would eat us. And again, what has saved humans has been the fact that we got this big brain. I don't know if it's saving us anymore, another discussion perhaps, but the fact that we can survive by our wits. That's what it's been, that we can find food. We can realize we don't want to go to a certain place because there might be an animal there that can eat us. This is how we survived.
Yeah, it's pretty striking. So David, let's go into some more granular details about uric acid. When we talked about the foods that raise it, we talked about foods that can help lower it, essentially plant foods, plant-rich foods, cherry extract, and so forth. There's also interaction with medications. There's a lot of medications that can increase uric acid. Can you talk about those?
That's right. I think some of the biggest players as it relates to medication include aspirin. Over the years, everybody was told, take aspirin, it'll keep you from having a stroke or having your children born naked or whatever. Yeah. So everybody should be taking aspirin. Aspirin will raise uric acid. I think the other big players are water pills or diuretics. These directly are associated with increased uric acid, but there are a number of them. The proton pump inhibitors, that's a drug.
Acid blockers.
Acid blocking drugs taken by 15 million Americans over the counter, for crying out loud, are, in stuff that we've been talking about for the past few years, significantly associated with risk for Alzheimer's and stroke. And now we know that a powerful mechanism, we can get back to it, is maybe through the elevation of uric acid. Beta blockers, xylitol, we don't consider it a drug, but I include it there so I don't forget it, as a sugar alcohol that's very commonly added to food, significantly increases uric acid.
A lot of health foods have it, and there's a way of getting rid of sugar. So you might be thinking you're helping yourself on one hand, but on the other hand, you're putting in these sugar alcohols, which can be harmful, not just to uric acid, but also your microbiome and other issues.
Right. Oh, for sure. And even drugs that enhance nitric oxide for erectile dysfunction will raise uric acid. And let me unpack that just a little bit because I think it's really important.
Oh, wow.
Erectile
Although sex makes you live longer, so maybe it evens out. I don't
know. Maybe. Erectile function requires blood flow. And the real mechanistic issue that seems to have been defined for erectile dysfunction is lack of blood flow because of poor function of nitric oxide that would have allowed blood flow to allow an erection to take place. Turns out that men with elevated uric acid have about a 36 to 38% increased risk of being diagnosed with erectile dysfunction because, as I mentioned earlier, uric acid compromises the functionality of nitric oxide. So, and here's a drug that's then used for the erectile dysfunction, but that can further increase uric acid. So, wow, I think it's so important that people understand that. I mean, it's some interesting biochemistry. Other things that are associated with elevated uric acid include niacin, vitamin B3, and certain Parkinson's drugs like levodopa, and then a drug that's used for people with certain types of respiratory problems called theophylline. So that kind of rounds out the list of the big players as it relates to drugs. But aspirin gets a lot of press. When I would ask your viewers to Google two things: Uric, U-R-I-C, and the word metabolic. All the literature will come up, and there's a lot of it. And included in that will certainly be, lists of drugs that are associated with increasing uric acid. It's so far beyond gout, and kidney stones. It is a central, as the article title stated, a central player orchestrating much of our metabolic mayhem, as I call it in the book.
And then talk about Alzheimer's, because that's your specialty is neurology. And it seems that this is also connected to Alzheimer's, that uric acid may be linked to the risk of Alzheimer's.
Well, you would expect that to be the case, and it really is. There was a big study published in 2018 that looked at individuals, 1,600 people, followed them for 12 years. And these people had, at the beginning of the study, a measurement of their uric acid level and an MRI scan of the brain. And neurocognitive testing. In other words, how well is their brain working? And those neurocognitive tests were repeated 6 times during the 12 years. So let's say every 2 years. And what they found, 1,600 people, is that those individuals who had the highest level of uric acid had an 80% increased risk of being diagnosed with dementia, a
Wow.
55% increased risk of that dementia, of having actual Alzheimer's disease, and a
Wow.
165% increased risk of what's called vascular or mixed form dementia. So
Mm.
it's powerfully threatening to the brain,
Wow.
as you might expect. Why? The brain requires fuel, sure, but if we induce insulin resistance by having high levels of uric acid, like we've talked about, the brain requires insulin to use its glucose, that's for sure. But insulin in the brain also acts as what we call a trophic hormone. It nurtures the brain cells. When we compromise insulin's ability to nurture the brain cells, we take away the support. We take away, the nurturing, the loving, what gives the brain cells what they need to function. So when we also consider how uric acid threatens nitric oxide, and that threatens blood supply,
Mm-hmm.
that explains why we see such an increased number of small strokes in the brain. There was another
Yeah.
study that it was not a prospective study. This is a study that looked at a group of individuals, 168 individuals, and it's a study done right now. They took a group of elderly people. They measured their uric acid. They did some neurocognitive testing to see how their brains are working, and they did MRI scans of the brain. What did
Yeah.
they find? It was 228 people. They found that those individuals who had the highest level of uric acid were 4 times as likely to be demented.
Wow.
Fourfold increased risk of dementia, those who had the highest levels of uric acid. And, it all makes sense when we understand that we're compromising blood supply, we're increasing inflammation, a central pillar of Alzheimer's, and we're messing up how insulin works throughout the body, including the brain. Powerful mechanism that the brain doesn't appreciate. I've had several very interesting conversations with a colleague of yours, Dr. Dale Bredesen, and he is vigorously involved in looking at uric acid levels as it relates to Alzheimer's, and
Yeah.
then getting uric acid levels to come down as, one of the important pillars. He looks at a lot of different things, unlike modern medicine that only wants to find one intervention to fix that problem. But as you know, Dr. Bredesen is reversing Alzheimer's by
Yeah.
looking at multiple inputs. And certainly moving forward, uric acid is a powerful player.
Now, David, this is something you may not have come across, but I've come across it, and it's sort of an anecdotal observation. But sometimes uric acid levels are very low, and usually they're sort of written off as irrelevant. But I've noticed that they're often correlated with heavy metal toxicity. Have you found that? Is there any data on that? You know anything
Yeah, there
about
is,
that?
as a matter of fact. And, the whole notion of us defining the upper limit of good uric acid speaks to what we call this U-shaped curve, or Goldilocks zone. I don't want to say sweet spot, for obvious reasons, but that there's an ideal place for anything, whether it's your blood sugar, the amount of sleep that you get, you name it. And it may be that this is the case with uric acid as well. While I've not seen specific correlation with heavy metals, there is some discussion that uric acid does represent some form of an antioxidant in the body, and having really low levels of uric acid might be threatening. That data is really based upon the observation that cachectic, or really, really thin elderly people with very low levels of uric acid, and with dementia, and have very low levels of uric acid. And I think the explanation that's been offered, because I've asked actually Dr. Richard Johnson about this,
Yeah.
he says,
Yeah.
these are people that have no body mass whatsoever, and
Yeah.
their food consumption is such that they're not going to that their uric acid level is going to be really, really low. So he looks upon it more as an effect as opposed to being a cause, and therefore, we don't really have the ability to define what is too low a level of uric acid. I think defining the upper limit these days makes sense. The average uric acid level in 1920 was 3.5. Now the average level is above the ideal level. The average level is 6.0 in America.
Interesting. So you don't think it's necessarily correlated with heavy metals?
I would have to think about that. I won't just offer an off the cuff evaluation, but how interesting it is that the consumption in 1900 of humans consuming fructose, we would consume about 15 grams a day. A couple of apples, pieces of fruit, whatever. Now the average daily consumption of fructose, I'm not saying sugar, of fructose is 55 grams a day, and
Whoa.
that increase in fructose consumption, those curves perfectly line up, as you would expect, with uric acid levels over time. So, everything's fitting together. And when we look at obesity rates, a third of adults being obese right now, as you and I have this conversation, that number is going to be 50% in the distant future, which is 2030. Hey, that's not the distant future. I know we're trying to be evergreen, but that's 8 years from now. That'll be
Yeah.
50% of adults in America are not just
Wow.
overweight, are obese. And that is a scary, scary proposition. I mean,
Very scary.
how are we going to care for those individuals? We've seen that lifespan is decreasing in America pre-COVID. Certainly, COVID has added to the decline, but it was declining pre-COVID, and that makes sense now when we look at these numbers. And I look at them through the lens of uric acid. The reason being is I want uric acid to be a new important metabolic marker. I'd like people to go to the doctor and have their blood sugar measured, their fasting insulin measured, their waistlines, blood pressure, and uric acid as well. A very important and powerful biometric, not just because it's a biometric and we can look in and say, it's elevated, but we can fix it. Getting your uric acid level down really is mechanistically a way to regain metabolic health.
I think this is staggering. And I just want to recap for everybody about, sort of really understand this. First of all, take us through why uric acid briefly is such an important thing to measure at your doctor's, what the numbers should be, and what the main foods that cause it to go up, the main foods that cause it to go down. And then we'll kind of follow up with what are the supplements to take and how do we sort of
Sure.
sort through
But let
this?
me preface that, if I could, by a statement. And I don't mean anything rude by this, but it's something, again, that those of us in functional medicine have come up against over the years. And that is simply the idea that your mainstream doctor may be unaware of the relationship of uric acid to metabolic issues. And I would say simply, the query would be, doctor, please just Google uric or uric acid and the word metabolic. That's all you got to do. If you want to do it on PubMed, all the better, right? But to be fair, most doctors, many of us, we were told that uric acid is only important as it relates to gout and kidney stones. End of story. And if you don't have gout or kidney stones, you have nothing to worry about. Even if your uric acid level is sky high, that just is not the case anymore. We see interventional trials using drugs where blood pressure is lowered, using allopurinol that lowers uric acid. So, these studies even in adolescents, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, adolescents who, now 10% of kids between the ages of 12 and 19 are hypertensive.
Mm-hmm.
10%. So
Wow.
metabolic issues are something that are affecting younger and younger people. We've got to pay attention to this, and uric acid is playing a very important mechanistic role. So preface my response by saying, lovingly, kindly mention to your doctor, hey, as a matter of fact, I saw this podcast with Dr. Hyman, and I learned that uric acid might be a little bit more important than just, gout, and ask him or her to look into that. So first and foremost, fructose. It is, as Dr. Lustig says, it's the alcohol without the buzz. It is profoundly threatening to us. We've known that since the Lancet published it in 1970,
Oh, yeah.
but now we understand how and why. And
Yes.
how and why has to do with how it's metabolized into this central player, uric acid, no longer just associated with gout and kidney stones.
Yeah.
So by and large, in our foods, it is fructose.
But if it's
In
also
so many
sugar,
of
it's
them.
also flour. It's anything that's sort of a refined
Yeah.
starchy carbohydrate, which has sugar in it, which are carbohydrates get converted to fructose when you eat them. So
That's right. And
it's
even
mostly high
salt.
fructose corn syrup, but you
And,
got to
the
understand it's
amount of
more than
salt,
just that.
anything above 11 grams per day already triggers that enzyme to convert your blood sugar into fructose, making even more. So, we've recently seen a lot of press about wanting to recommending to us to lower our sodium consumption. We've known that for years, but now we have another reason to do that, because high levels of serum sodium will convert, as we say, the blood sugar that we have into fructose, adding fuel to the fire. So by and large, it's fructose. If your uric acid is elevated, you want to cut out the fructose in your diet, but you may eat fruit.
You
But
pretty
you
much
also
want to
want
do it
to.
anyway. Nobody should be having high fructose corn syrup, period. I mean, if you would
That's
say
right.
to
I
me,
mean,
what are the two things that we should never eat? It's high fructose corn syrup and trans fats. And that immediately cuts out like 95% of processed food.
well, what am I going to eat? You mean I can't
Food.
eat something out of a box? No, you shop the periphery of the grocery store, and you have foods that don't have a barcode, that they might even have to weigh. My
That's
gosh.
right. That's right.
Um, The other contributors are alcohol, and again, some wine, a glass or two is fine. And the studies actually did not delineate between red and white. I would say red, based on its bioflavonoid content, would probably be a better choice. But beer is a big problem. You wonder why people have beer bellies, because it's purine rich and contains alcohol, and hard liquor as
Yeah.
well. The other issue would be purine-rich animal-based foods. All animal meats
Organs.
have purines in them, but it really depends on what your uric acid level is. And to that, I would say, so 6 ounces of chicken, if you're a meat eater, or steak or whatever it may be, is going to be acceptable. But higher purine foods are things like shellfish and
Mm-hmm.
scallops, and small fish, the anchovies and sardines that we've all favored over the years for other reasons.
Yeah.
That lower in bioaccumulation, and certainly higher in good fats. But that said, you may get away with it, but you won't know until you follow your uric acid level.
That's the
And what I'm
level.
saying is, see your doctor on occasion. See where you are today with your uric acid level. To know your uric acid level might be as simple as picking up the phone.
Yeah.
I don't know, people pick up the phone anymore, I think, or reaching in your pocket, I guess. I
Hey
still have
Siri,
landlines.
call blah blah blah.
Let's get my uric acid level.
You want to know my secrets for living a long and happy and healthy life? Well, all I have to do is check out my weekly newsletter, Mark's Picks, where I share my favorite tips for health, longevity, well-being, and lots more. Check it out, and link below. Listen, you have laid out brilliantly why we should be caring about uric acid, and why people should buy your book, Drop Acid, because it really explains this in great detail and helps you understand what to test for, what to look for, what you should eat, what you shouldn't eat, and also what are the other things you can do to protect yourself. And you mentioned some medications that we should be wary of: diuretics, acid blockers, aspirin, others that people should be cautious if they're taking these, to pay attention and check your levels. And then lastly, there are a number of different natural products and supplements that can help bring it down. We mentioned cherry extract, but you also mentioned a few others. Could you just kind of summarize those briefly?
Sure. The big player would be quercetin. And I'm certain you've had people on your program who've talked about quercetin from other perspectives,
Yes.
as a senolytic, perhaps, being able to help us get rid of aged immune cells, as an antioxidant, its role in inflammation. But now we recognize that quercetin actually works in the same way as the gout drug allopurinol. It targets an enzyme that is fundamental for producing uric acid, called xanthine oxidase. So it is a xanthine oxidase inhibitor, like the drugs used to treat gout. Even more potent might be another bioflavonoid that's called luteolin. So
Mm.
I'll give you dosages. I would consider, I'm not your healthcare practitioner, but the typical doses that will work would be quercetin 500 milligrams a day.
Mm.
Luteolin would be about 100 milligrams a day.
Mm.
Vitamin C, which aids in excreting uric acid. Vitamin C has been the darling supplement for gout patients for decades. And that would be, again, about 500 milligrams per day. Maybe 1,000 milligrams of DHA would be reasonable. Again, not that it's having a direct effect on uric acid, although I think it does, but because it offers an offset to other things that are going on. It decreases inflammation. It stimulates the production of something called BDNF, which we need for
Yeah.
brain cell health, offsetting the damaging effects of this insulin resistance that people tend to develop. So I'm I couldn't help myself but include DHA in the recommendations. To be sure, there are other issues that we should consider in the time we have left, and that would be that sleep plays a role. That
Sleep.
not getting enough restorative sleep is associated with increased uric acid. And that sedentarity, meaning sitting on your rear end a lot and not getting out and moving, will be associated with elevated uric acid. And one other point as it relates to exercise, I think is really important, that if you suddenly engage in a level of exercise that's far more vigorous than you are used to, you will break down some of your body tissue, some of your muscles, for example. Like you go on a long run, you'll break down muscle tissue, and that will transiently increase what are called purines in your body, and that will raise, in the short term, uric acid. Interestingly,
Amazing.
we know that if you fast, you're going to raise your uric acid levels transiently, but ultimately, that fasting is going to do good things for your metabolism. So again, we're thinking that fasting and time-restricted eating are all, in fact, I put it in the book, all good ideas as it relates to metabolic health in the long run. But if you're testing your uric acid during a fast or when you're deeply into ketosis, it will momentarily be a little bit elevated. The messaging here is take a chill pill, take a deep breath. It's going to be fine. You'll be better off when it's all said and done.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. So everybody needs to sort of get this. We need to pay attention to uric acid. We need to test it. We need to change our diet to get rid of the high fructose corn syrup, add in a lot more plant foods and a number of supplements, and we can really mitigate this risk. And it's not just a bystander molecule that we check and see it's elevated in the context of diabetes, but it actually is one of the mechanistic drivers of a lot of these problems. So it's important.
That's right. It's in the driver's seat. It's orchestrating. So, and again, the story about how we got here from 14 million years ago is really so interesting. When researchers look at hunter-gatherer populations that are still living on the planet in South America, for example, we find that A, their uric acid levels are really low, and B,
wow.
They have a variety. When you look at their blood work and other markers, they have very low levels of fasting insulin. Their blood sugars are lower. Their insulin sensitivity is higher. Their bone density is higher. Their visual acuity is higher. Blood pressure is lower. The raising of blood pressure with age isn't happening. Leptin sensitivity is maintained. So all the things that we talk about that are related to better metabolic health are seen in those cultures that haven't yet stumbled on the sugar and whose uric acid levels remain low.
It's amazing. So people, if you listening to this, I hope you learned that we're in trouble because of all the high fructose corn syrup and the fructose and everything that we're eating is, as well as the sugar and starch, that uric acid is such a big deal that we pretty much ignored. I obviously followed it in my lab test for years, but never really understood the depth of how it interacts with our biology to cause all host of chronic diseases, and that there's a way to fix it. So, David, thank you so much for writing your book, Drop Acid, The Surprising New Science of Uric Acid, the Key to Losing Weight, Controlling Blood Sugar, and Achieving Extraordinary Health. It's available. You can go get it anywhere you get books. Go to drperlmutter.com/books/drop-acid if you want to learn more. I encourage you to get the book, share it with your friends and family, share this podcast with your friends and family. I bet you they're going to be very interested in what David has to say. He's always coming up with the newest and most interesting things, from brain to brainwash to the book about the brain and gut connection, the brain maker. So David's really been on leading edge for so many years, and I love you, David. I love your work. Leave a comment. Let us know how maybe you've struggled with uric acid and what you've done to fix it. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and we'll see you next week on The Doctor's Pharmacy. If you loved that last video, you're going to love the next one. Check it out here.
What is our immune system and what does it do? And of course, the AIDS explosion led to developments in immunology that we'd never seen before. It accelerated science in immunology. And now